here this evening talking with Andrea Zimmerman about her film Here for Life, which is an extraordinary piece of film and an extraordinary piece of art, I think. The film's going to be showing in Bury Art Museum. It's going to be in the film booth there, so anybody in the locality can come down and absorb yourself in this very, very beautiful piece of work. It's actually centered around a project that's been put together by Cardboard Citizens, who are a theatre company based in London, it's a theatre company of people who have experienced homelessness or are experiencing homelessness. And Andrea coexisted with them for time while making the film. And
oops, sorry.
Dog Ella is also part of this conversation. And just not to be outdone, my cat Purdy has just marched into the shot as well. So Andrea actually is credited as co-directing the film with Adrian Jackson, who's the director of Cardboard Citizens. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you, Andrea, is tell me about the seed of the film, how the film came to life.
So we, so Adrian and I. We met, we knew about each other for quite some time, but we met for the first time in 2013, I think, at the London Film Festival. And I had made a film with John Berger on his book, based on his book King, which is about it's about a community which has been displaced and marginalized by the forces of, on the one hand, gentrification, but also, and capital, but also by the kind of cultural responses to people who are homeless or are seen as lesser than people who are fulfilling a kind of life that is desired or seen as desirable in culture. And it's a really beautiful book, and it was told through the voice of a dog. And it's really, yeah, so I made this film, and then Adrian had made a play with the same book with Cardboard Citizens a few years earlier. And so we thought, okay, maybe we should work together on something. And then we got together, and we didn't really know each other. We knew about each other's work, but we didn't know each other. And so we tried to see how can actually a theatre maker and a filmmaker work together, which is such a different practice. So because theatre is all about this, projecting, and film is profoundly quiet and making spaces where things can unfold. So we weren't initially even sure if we wanted to work with Cardboard Citizens. So we proposed this project to Art Angel, and we got the Art Angel Open Award, which was an amazing opportunity, therefore, to have enough support to work over a longer period of time with people, and without knowing initially what the outcome would be. So it was, look at the cats. I hope they will make like a little Zoom film with all the animals in the, and I hope Ella will come back, my dog. But so we weren't really quite sure where it was going to take us initially, and we were supported in that journey, which was a big trust by Art Angel. It was wonderful and a real privilege to have had that. And so initially we did outreach workshops with people that I knew, people Adrian knew, people, different communities. We just traveled all across London, worked with elderly communities, with cyclists, with anybody who we thought was part of the survival of in London today or in a big city today, but also about making the city in their own terms. And so we worked also with people and organizations who work with people with no recourse to public funds, and lots of those kind of environments, and people who have to really work very hard to survive. And these are the invisible stories, right? And so we then met a few people, and one of them is also in the film. And it was an amazing, of course, coincidence, but also was a brilliant encounter. Or I'm an actor, I would like to be in a film. So when we started actually making this film, we invited everybody who had kind of expressed an interest to come to the auditions. We call them auditions, but it was mainly group building, right? And then quite a few of the people from Cardboard Citizens that I had watched plays or performances and picked out, or people I remembered who I kind of was drawn to, and I thought, oh, I would like to work with them at some point or something. Yes. And then the other people and Adrian suggested. So it was like a mix of us making proposals of people, and then we started working with the group that then became eventually, after several months, this final group. It was kind of self-selecting. We didn't even know how many people did we want to have in it. I mean, it couldn't have been too many, but that kind of group of 10 just kind of shaped itself.
Okay, okay, yeah. It's because it feels like, it feels as if it's a collaboration, and that's a cat sitting on a keyboard. It feels like it's a collaboration. You know, it feels like you've made something together, and I wonder, was that something? Did you feel that there was a kind of there were things that everybody agreed that you wanted to do, or how did it become shaped? Because it feels like it's a very dreamlike film, and I would say to somebody who comes to watch it that it actually stretches your ideas in all sorts of ways, including your ideas of time and story. But it also feels as if there are some very clear intentions, it seems to me, and I wondered if you could talk about some of those ideas, and if you guys agreed.
So I observed a lot how Adrian was working, and because I'm very drawn to Auguste Boal's method too, and Auguste Boal, who wrote The Theatre of the Oppressed, so he was a radical theatre practitioner, and what I always drew from him in film was who is telling whose story how. And in Auguste Boal's kind of methodology, I mean, he has many different kinds of expressions of how a structure could work as a kind of radical narrative possibility or something. But what for me always was the one which I've applied a lot with is like the idea of the joker, where a participant can say, or an audience member could say, oh, this is not how we should tell it. We should tell it like this, or I don't recognize myself in this. Can we try it like this? So I use this in my story development a lot.
Yeah.
And Adrian uses it obviously differently, and he uses it more properly than I have appropriated it for filmmaking, right? But then I like just observing how he was working with actors. I saw there's another technique which is very much about how do we inhabit each other's stories. So it's about story swapping. So it's actually essentially to make actors perform better and to get them out of their head. And there's like a lot of overlaps, but for me, what was so interesting is when you're slightly outside of that, I thought, no, that's actually a technique we should put into the foreground. So we got people to respond to an external object. For example, in our case, it was we were looking for a film. I always do this in all my work. I show a lot of cinema or films so people have a shared language, right? So it's a starting point for something.
So you guys sit down and watch films together and talk about them. And,
so
great.
And the first one, so the main one we really explored was Vittorio De Sica's 1948 film, The Bicycle Thieves. And it's often hailed as the kind of masterpiece of cinema and neorealism, but it's like a melodrama too, right? Like it's very complicated when you analyze it, because morally, who is allowed to dream? So I have a very difficult relationship with that film.
Okay. Yeah.
Because the man is the dreamer, right? And ultimately then his dream gets squashed in the end. So he's also not allowed to dream, but he's dreaming above others. And so we were really trying to think through who's allowed to dream. And so we analyzed this film together, and then we started role playing. Each of them chose a character they wanted to play of that film. And we just did workshops like this. And then we started saying, okay, there were these 6 components: greed, hope, when have you done harm on somebody and it was unfair, when have you taken something that wasn't yours, When have you been violated? Because in the film, all of these things happen, right? So it's a very kind of archetypal story of love, loss, and so then we started sharing our own stories around these themes. So there was already a prompt. So instead of asking, like, tell me about your life, it's like, tell me about those themes. And immediately what happens then in film, it becomes much more universal specific, but also universal in a way that the story can be recognized by hopefully somebody else, because it's ultimately about sharing a story rather than just you in yourself. Because for me as a filmmaker, I find it always deeply troublesome when people say I'm making a portrait of someone, because all the stuff you omit, you don't put in it. It's also that person. So it's always like it's an interpretation of someone, right? And we were interested in really like, how do we make the world rather than how do we interpret the characters?
It felt as if the stories were being inhabited. A story would be inhabited by one person and then by another, and different people were bringing really different feelings to those same ideas. And I guess, and I found it fascinating because I think that the way that homelessness is treated is often that there are certain kinds of they're kind of cliches almost that come into play, and that things have to be very gritty, and that things have to be very truthful, but in a journalistic kind of a way, and that and so what happens is that loads of stuff gets flattened out, and lots of richness in people's lives kind of disappears. And what you seem to be doing here was really, really consciously making a film that stands all of that stuff on its head. And it's a film, I mean, and I've used the word beautiful, but it is a film that is, it seems almost consciously beautiful. It's a bit like, for somebody who's not seen it, it's a little bit like Midsummer Night's Dream. It feels very, very magical. And there's these kind of extraordinary sounds that swim in and out. You're in the middle of a city, and yet you hear, or you think you hear, insects chirruping, and you think you hear, is that, am I in the middle of the desert almost? And it's quite, it's very different to a documentary, a hard-hitting documentary that somebody's put together about, in inverted commas, problem people, or so this idea that you're also kind of saying, okay, so who owns this story? Who's a victim? What is a question? You're questioning an awful lot, and that sometimes that makes it and as I said at the beginning, it makes it a kind of tough is the wrong word, but it's a as a watch, there are the time stretches and moves about, and you feel you're drawn into it, and you think, oh yeah, I'm really with somebody now, and then you suddenly think, no, I don't understand this at all. Could you talk a little bit about that, about this dream?
It's a very good observation, and I thank you really for pointing that out, because that was the aim, was for me to show a counter memory to that, how we almost erase the experience of people's lives through mainstream and dominant tropes of representation. And that goes in all sorts of different directions, right? Like, we make people victims, or we make people who have been subject to extreme violence, for example, we make them another victim. So who is looking, whose gaze is it that we're looking through? Is always usually the like white, colonial, or European middle class gaze, right? So, and that goes all the way in everywhere. So we have to resist and refuse and find new ways of representation, be it through poetry and songs. So for me, these are the kind of really strong moments that cannot be fixed. They cannot be fixed, i.e. fixed by this is how you are. But they are the ones you can't even tear down a song, right? Like, or you can't tear down poetry. There's a reason why these things are intangible. Intangibility is almost the strength, the resistance and the refusal to re-marginalization or re-erasure. So for me as a filmmaker, I see myself much more as a poet, I guess, like of the image. So it's purposefully beautiful, but it's because I'm approaching it with a sense of care and attention in the sense that's all I can give it is my attention, and my skill is to lend my eye in a way, or make an environment by which I can see properly, and I see the beauty in a human being or a non-human being whom I work with. And how do our stories unfold, even if they're difficult stories, right? Even if their transgressions happen, because that's what we also do. We are not just one type of person. So difficulty, and we also perpetuate difficult things upon other bodies because of our own trauma and pain often, right? And structural injustices. So it's about not looking away from those moments, but trying to give way to the full complexity of what a human being is. And then in terms of sound, so Marie Touege, who was the sound designer, and we chose her, but me in particular, because I wanted to work with her, because she is an amazing sound artist, and she does a lot of work with Foley. So I think we had like tens and tens and tens of tracks of insects and breath, and all of this stuff was very consciously done, but it had to be subtle enough so you don't go, oh, this is Foley sound, or this is strange sound. So it's like a symphony almost. So we spent a lot of time and doing the sound really well. Like that was a whole, for me, like one of the most important other things than the image is the feeling, because we don't when it works well, you don't quite know why it feels, why there's suddenly an absence, or like even in Dungeness, right? There's a lot of sounds, it's not there. There's no sound of the sea in a lot of the scenes, even though you're looking at the sea or stuff like this. So we worked a lot with absence and presence, but it had to be subtle enough that it sneaks in, and suddenly you're in a dream, and suddenly you're awake, and like just how you said,
it's very entrancing. And then there's this other fantastic element to the soundtrack as well, which is it Rich? I'm not sure if I'll say his name. It's Richard Hunnigan.
Richard Hunnigan.
He's called Milo. Is that right? Mm-hmm. He's a gift as well. I mean, what a great soundtrack. The songs are great. There's one, is it Fish to Fry? Which is, I like fish. And that's just this, they're terrific songs, and they're really kind of hefty. You're talking about these sort of the delicacy of these pieces that have been constructed as Foley, and then on the other end of it, there's this big bottom end, and there's this really powerful voice, and these great kind of they're dance tracks, but they're also quite humorous, and they're also they're electronic, but they're quite kind of handmade as well. And so tell me a little bit about that, about how you brought that in, because this is another contributor who's seen on screen but is also very much heard.
So part of in Cardboard Citizen, they have a lot of workshops also around sound workshops because a lot of performers are musicians. They express themselves through song, and Richard was one of the people who he was one of the most talented actors I've ever worked with, because he's not only incredible in music, but he's also incredible. He can both perform on film and on stage without any moment of preparation. He can improvise. He feels the different spaces so naturally. It's a really difficult thing to do for an actor, to traverse these spaces authentically, like in that way, so readily. He's amazing. And the thing is like how the songs came about. So there was one scene about stealing the fish, which is in the film, and stealing a fish which they can't really steal, right? And it came out of a real event when we asked in Billingsgate Fish Market, or we asked some people like, what is the silliest theft that ever happened here? And then they're like, oh, someone tried to steal a salmon. And then we asked some of the people who we work with, what I didn't realize, and it's also a language thing because I'm not English native speaker. So for example, one of the actors, Patrick, he was talking about oysters. And I was like, oh, you like oysters? He's like, oh, Andrea, it's those people who would then steal for you, right? Like there's sort of all these kind of slangs, which I didn't know. So it was really interesting. It was very creative and playful. Anyway, and then I wanted to have the fish. And then we wanted to have a fish scene where we would go fishing, which is also in the film, right? But not kill the fish. And then just saying that, like bringing that scene when we were like workshopping, or what should we do, and blah, blah, blah. We just talking about it. And then Richard, 2 days later, came back, I've got a song for you, Fish to Fry. So that's how the songs, more or less, he just riffed off of, everybody kind of riffed off of each other. It was a very creative space because we had time, right, with people. I mean, we weren't working full time, but the moments we had together, it was very generous. Everybody constantly played with each other's stuff and brought something new to the table in a way. Yeah.
I would like so there's something about creative spaces I'd like to bring in as well, which is where the film is shot, which is a place called the Nomadic Gardens, and it seems to me that's a really crucial bit of the language of this film, or the setting of this film, or it's almost a stage set, and actually I guess you should talk about it rather than me trying to explain it.
It doesn't exist anymore. So they've just closed it.
But it does exist in your film.
I'm so glad. No, but it was for viewers who don't know. So the Nomadic Gardens was the Nomadic Community Gardens, and it was in London, very close to Liverpool Street, which is the financial centre, very close to the city, and there is a Brick Lane, which is in the East End, like an old East End street, and literally just off of it, which is full of tourism, Brick Lane. It's packed with people now at the moment, not, but it used to be absolutely packed and rammed with people, and restaurants up and down and everything. And just behind there are 2 train tracks, and in between the 2 train tracks was this nomadic garden space, which was self-built by people who were using it. So the stage which we used was a theatre built by people who were actually in the nomadic gardens themselves, and were using it for Power Carnival and for community events. They were imperfect, they were beautiful, and Selim, who was hosting the Power Carnival there, he allowed us to use the space. But also Jono, who was one of our actors, he gave loads of workshops there. This is how we started to actually work there. And I first came across it by cycling with my dog, and then my dog disappeared into that space. And my old estate where I lived, not very far from there, we used to have bonfires, and then it was demolished, and I really missed the bonfires. And there they had a bonfire, so I went in there looking for my dog, because she walked after another dog. And they were like so friendly and said, oh, just come sit in the fire, have something to drink, whatever. And they were playing music. I was like, oh my God, this space. And then when we found out Jono was working there, or like doing workshops there, volunteering, we were like, it just has to be, because what Adrian and I were looking for originally was a temporary autonomous zone. So we wanted to set up a community. We wanted to squat a place which was empty, right? And we would just take it over. By the time they would kick us out, we would have made the work, but we would have made it greener and better. So, but that place offered everything. It offered community already, and we could have an exchange there, which is why it was also important when the film was finished that the first place we brought it there instead of going to a film festival. So we compromised a film festival release, even because we wanted to show it there for 10 days before anywhere else. And it was...
Oh, wow. So that's where it premiered, at the Nomadic Gardens.
Yeah. Before I went to Locarno, yeah.
It's a lovely idea. A nomadic garden is just a great idea. And it also makes me think about I mean, you talk in some of your work about the relationship to ecology and for me, one of the things that I think about when I think about homelessness is that because of the way that the world is changing, that probably we're going to look at a lot of people becoming nomadic, and that this is something that's already starting to happen because of the ecological situation. And I wonder whether places like the nomadic garden and the experience of people who have experienced homelessness, so are have in a sense been nomadic. I wonder if there's things to be learned.
I mean, you know, I say this quite a lot, but if power was redistributed, we would have a different society, obviously, right? Like, because people know much better how to survive and how to live, but we're not allowed to. We are forced to live a certain way, and people get exhausted trying otherwise, or they get nowhere otherwise. So I think it's a real structural violence of, you know, capital exploitation. I mean, who is benefiting from all of that? Whereas people would look out for each other in a way that, you know, the big society idea is a joke. And of course, you know, it's even like to the fact where people say like people need the houses. There are enough houses in London. There are enough houses. They're empty. They're empty in second and third homes or whatever. There are enough houses. So we could have policies that say you can't have a second home, or your tax would be higher like other countries have, or whatever, or they have to be occupied. I mean, it's actually relatively straightforward and easy, but the will is not there from power to be. So some people, you know, and obviously like on the, I mean, you know all of this, and hopefully we'll talk a little about your work, which is so incredible too, and I want to know more about it. But like, you know, some people can survive much easier on the streets than other people can, or in these communities. Like for women, or queer people, it's much harder to survive because you're already you face a different set of violence. You know, so there's it's tough. It's tough because power is literally taken away from people, and the hope is, of course, in this momentary coming together, and people can look out for each other, and then it goes again. And some people survive it very easily, and some people find it harder. And how to make community, you know, and community making is a powerful thing, and therefore it's undesirable too for power.
It's, I mean, one of the reasons that I'm talking to you today is because some of the work that I've been involved with has shown at Bury Art Gallery, and they exhibited a project which called the Homeless Library, which came out of Arthur and Martha, which I'm the co-director of with Lois Blackburn. And Arthur and Martha, we basically put together an idea to do a history of British homelessness, just to talk to people and to talk to our elderly people. And it's kind of a small project, but it's, I think we did about 70 interviews with people who either witnessed homelessness back in the 30s or 40s or 50s, or else were currently or had experienced contemporary homelessness. But what I felt really strongly as a poet, that this wasn't sufficient. These stories weren't sufficient, and so what we did was we actually invited people to make books, make handmade books, and inscribe and take apart books that have already been printed, and then inscribe their own stories onto those books and remake the books. And so we did that. With that project it was launched at the Houses of Parliament with the intention of saying these stories also exist. And the thing, I mean, it's one of the things I'm proudest of in my life, to have been involved in that. And I mean, it's not mine, you know, but I was part of that thing. But one of the things that really struck me about it was that how come this tiny little organization of two people is trying to tell the history of British homelessness? Where are the historians? Where are the people who should be doing this stuff? How, you know, I couldn't believe it. We were looking up for weeks. We were looking up on the internet stuff, going, but where's all the others? You know, where are those stories? I mean, right now we're doing a project which is like a medieval illuminated manuscript that people are making at a place called the Booth Centre in Manchester, and Back on Track in Manchester, and many of them people who've experienced homelessness, and the idea is to kind of imply, well, and this has always been here. This history has always been here. So how come this is being disallowed? I think that what comes through very strongly in your work is that it's about allowing. You know, you really make this, it feels very safe. You're not traumatizing people. You're actually messing with the viewers' heads. You know, if anything, you're playing with the person who's sitting there feeling safe, stops feeling safe after a bit, and you start thinking, I don't actually know what is going on here, but something's happening, and I don't know what it is. Which is, you know, really, really interesting thing to do. You talk a lot about poetry and the poetry of film, and you've got the poster for Here for Life behind you, and it's actually got a boat, and the boat's in a very particular place, and it refers to Derek Jarwin. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and the poetics of all of that.
So I love Derek Jarman's work because I always loved his work because he worked on both big budgets and small budgets, but he found allegiances and allyship across centuries. So he would put, for example, into his film Caravaggio,
mobile phones.
Gangs. Yeah. So he would just sandwich time regardless of, and I really believe in the possibility of time that's not linear, right? Like for these reasons, because we have to find allyship across times. And the linearity is an ideological construct too, like what was before was worse, what's coming after is better. And I think we see this very much in recent times, that they say, yeah, but all of this happens, but it's actually getting better for people. And I think it's a dangerous narrative. Like, of course, statistically, it depends who's writing what statistic and who's looking at what material, it might get better. But if you look at different parameters, it's almost like who's writing the codes, who's writing face recognition software, right? Which is deeply racist. So who is writing this stuff? Who is looking at this stuff? So we wanted to go to, so it came out of a lot of finding out. So my other task is always to find out information about people, right? And so Richard said at one point, we were just talking and he said he'd never been to the sea. So we're like, oh my God, we have to take him to the sea. We have a film to make a scene at the sea. And then we needed a friendship scene. So it was like, okay, why don't we just set this scene at the seaside? And then of course, what seaside could be less iconic or more, there could be nothing better than Derek Jarman's Dungeness. So we went there and they're really brilliant. And we knew already, it's like, okay, we don't have permission because we didn't have that kind of high budget. So we had to do a lot of stuff just like that. And also I like working this way. It's like on your feet. So we said, okay, it was also very improvisational, right? So we had a scene, but it was worked out during the making often. And I like working that way, which means that if we repeat it, it would come out totally different. So, you know, we had different kind of emotional flavors. But within 10 minutes, literally the police came, because it's owned by a EDF, the energy company.
Right.
And so the thing is, so we saw, okay, they're coming. We're like, okay, quickly, I'm positioning the camera like this. Adrian, you talk to them. We were filming, and then we were filming the whole rest of the scene while we were walking off. And there's the security guards walking with us. And that's how good our actors were too. We were just using all these tensions and the chargedness of it. But it was quite shocking to me that the whole beach can be privatized, right? It's such a beautiful, beautiful beach, and it's private. It's private. It should be public land. Like, I'm totally against. I think the land belongs to all of us. We can't own it, and especially this kind of. Everyone has the right to be at the seaside. right? As you wish. And the worst thing about it, I just want to say, because I feel so strongly about this, but like even in our local parks, right? In some of the parks, people are moved on just because of sitting on a bench and talking, and they're not the right kind of people for the park. So by being able to do that means that already some people are valued more than others. And public space for me is that space where there's no such thing happening. And I want that space where there's no such thing happening, where you move someone on just because they don't look right.
It feels as if in the film, that's very much what you're trying to make. It's almost like a refuge. It feels as if there's this kind of, it feels very a compassionate space, perhaps. Now, we've just had a question arrive in from one of the people watching, and it's actually relating to the pandemic. Says, how do you envisage these characters or people like these characters would have coped during the pandemic? And has the pandemic been a creative time for you, or have you found it difficult to work? I imagine it has been different for each artist.
So for both of us, right? Like, you're welcome to answer.
Well, thank you very much.
No, I will answer. I have loads to say, but I feel like I speak a lot. So.
No, I think you should answer. Yeah, go on.
So I mean, I'm in touch with, for example, all the people in the film a lot, because we're doing quite a few events. So there's one coming up in 2 weeks' time in Liverpool, but they're all online, right? So I say it's happening in Liverpool, but actually it's just online. Like, this is happening in Bury, but I'm in London. So 2 of the people from the film will do the talk, and I will support them. So we've done quite a few of those things when we can, and when things are possible during this time, and trying to stay in touch in order to support each other. And, you know, some of the people in the film have very difficult circumstances. So one had to go from hostel to hostel, and like to try and keep her safe and like make her feel she's not going to implode, like, which was often the case, you know, like, and there's quite a lot of people in these situations. So there's a lot of care, like a lot of attempt on trying to make it better, but there's no such thing as better in those circumstances. So it's been hard for some of the people, and like many people, right? And everybody copes also with this stuff differently. Than me personally, for the first period of lockdown, because I have to teach part-time, and a lot of that went to, I was absolutely exhausted through pastoral care with our students who were going through a lot and looking out for people. And I started doing this, I was part of the food redistribution in our neighborhood, and so I was out every night, and it was intense. Like, it was quite intense and exhausting, and I was literally like a zombie. I couldn't be creative at all for quite some time, and I was just exhausted, and when I could, I just slept, actually. And then when the lockdown eased a little bit, out of the going out every day with the food distribution, also I met people who had no recourse to public funds in parks, and then started making a new work with a couple of them, and that's becoming a new film. But we tried again to show them without, you wouldn't know that they're living in a park for months. You wouldn't know. I mean, that's the aim. So only very perceptive people might understand that, but it's not about that. It's about their lives and their creativity, right? Like, so we try to find these kind of other ways of somehow making stuff together, making sense of what this meant, this period.
Yeah. And no, I think it's and that's such an interesting perspective to invite into the discussion, isn't it? You know, it's because there's a lot of people now commenting from very sort of safe positions, and on the one hand, but then on the other hand, I think that so at the moment during the lockdown, one of the things I've been doing is a lot of phone calls, doing phone calls with people, and kind of writing poems and songs and things over the phone, and recording them over the phone with a songwriter called Matt Hill, who sings with people. And and I've been doing the poetry writing, and which has been a kind of quite an amazing thing for me, because uh, a long time ago, when I was a kid, I went to university. I was lucky enough to go to university, and I would have poetry. I'd have tutorials with people, which, of course, you know, at that time I just thought were kind of tedious. I remember turning up at one wearing a pair of pajamas because I thought that was, you know, so funny, and then as I've been talking to people who are really struggling, and sometimes we'll spend maybe an hour talking about a poem that they're writing, and I'll say, you know, I'm going to ring up next week, and for some people, they said, nobody's ever done this to me before. I've never had this. I have never had this, where somebody's actually listened to me and we've talked about the themes of my life, and then we've come back to it the next week, and then we come back to the next week again, and I can feel my voice, you know, and it's been extraordinary for me. It's been very moving, and it's also told me how lucky I was. You know, when I was sitting there in a pair of pajamas, I just had no idea. So for me, though, one of the things that's come out of that is that perhaps if in your life there's more chance of mortality, there's more chance that you're going to die, or some of the people you know are going to die, then maybe right now that we're dealing with this pandemic situation, maybe people who've experienced mortality a little bit more have something to bring to that discussion, you know. So and I wonder, if you're living in a park, you're closer to some elemental forces, perhaps. I don't know. What are you finding? What are people saying to you?
Well, one of the people, he was very upset when somebody called him homeless.
Mm.
And we had a long conversation about that, because it happened very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think what you just raised is a really interesting point. Is like, so when do we give attention to each other as human beings that are fully fledged, i.e. we have ideas, right?
Mm.
We're not just people who eat and drink and consume television or something. But we actually are capable of thinking and creative thought and storytelling, and you know, and who gets to be nurtured even in the society to do that. But when you give attention to each other, and this is why art is such a crucial part of our everyday life, and why it's so important to have it in our lives, is because that's the one space where we can actually talk about things that are between us, the kind of spaces between us, right? And we can talk about the world in a different way. It's a risky space, but it's a safe, risky space in a lot of ways as well. So with this particular person in the park, when the time came that they could go, they decided to stay on for longer. One of the people who I work with most, in order to heal. That's the kind of phrasing, to be with the nature and in order to heal. And now it's getting obviously a little colder. But by now, what's so interesting is that the community that has, okay, I think this is also like a really beautiful thing that I've been able and the privilege to be part of during the making of this particular work, was that there were a lot of people who would bring food every day. Lots of different kind of people who themselves had nothing or had one stove, right? They would go home with the one stove, cook a meal and bring it every day without fail. And why? So when I started asking questions after like a few weeks of filming and like getting some trust and stuff, and then I'm recording sound and image separately in order to preserve the quality of it's not the real story, because it's so real, it's so close to reality. So I had to find a kind of a cinematic removal almost, or something. So,
Okay.
but then and then so I did a lot of audio recordings without then the image recording, right? And then vice versa. So, but in the audio recordings and also conversations, people said like they come and they do this and they say this person is just going through something, and let them heal. That came up over and over. And then a lot of the people who I interviewed had been refugees, had horrendous journeys getting here, or have to share a flat with many other people. So these people know what it means to need to be supported for a moment in order for you to heal, you know? And when do we ever talk about those kind of terms? Because of course, you just think, okay, I give a house, which should be available to everybody. I'm not saying that shouldn't be available to everybody. It should be available to everybody. But if you go back to early on, it's not just a house. It's about allowing a person to be and to live the way in which they wish to, rather than, okay, you can live in this house if you do A, B, C, and you behave in this way and that way, or whatever. Forgive the cat. But like, so for me, these were really important, crucial. So nobody had pity. So this was absolutely absent the whole way through. There was no feeling of pity at all. And then the interesting thing is like who was looking and who was looking and who was looking with knowledge and who was looking without knowledge. You can kind of start seeing those kind of things. It was, you know.
I think this is it's so it seems to be very much part of what you're doing. I mean, I hope some of what I do too. This idea that that you're making a space, maybe it's a safe space, and that people can come into that. They can make things together, and maybe there's the idea of healing, of actually taking some energy and some time and having some respite from what's going on around you. Those kinds of processes seem to be really around in this film. There's a beautifully tender moment. I think is it John O. Whitty, the guy who's got the butterfly, this amazing butterfly tattoo, and he's massaging someone's foot and says, and there's this great line. He says, "Pain leaves scars," and I thought, oh, that's such a wonderful line. One of the things I said was, when doing this interview, I wanted people to be able to come in and throw in questions. And actually, there's a question here, which is somebody said, "I like what Phil said about Andrea's work. Thank you." Feeling safe, yes, and then becoming something different. So it's safe, and then you're kind of moving that perception. Would Andrea agree?
I think it's a very big question, that question, because what does safe mean, right? Like safe on the one hand means, so I'm a maker, like if I see somebody in distress, I would help them before I would film them. So I'm not somebody who would go out and film a disaster. I can't do that. Like, so I have to work with people. I have to feel like I can exchange something with people. I have to have a gift. Either I can pay them, or there's another kind of exchange. So for example, the work in the park over lockdown or just out of lockdown, I have to think like that too, you know, because I can't offer a dwelling. And also, you know, but also at the same time, I don't want to just extract. So the space so what makes a safe space is an exchange. So initially for many weeks, I didn't even think about, I didn't want to make a film. Then through conversations, oh, I'm a filmmaker, or I'm a performer, this person, I do this, I do that. And then it came out of our conversations to we just start making something. And then other people, let's make something. That became this theater, not a theater like in Here for Life, a completely different performance space, right, in the park. And so it organically developed, and I brought photographs back. I printed really nice photographs for everyone as a memory. And then because it's also like it's a particularly beautiful park where I am, which allows people to stay. It doesn't move people on. It's important, right? It's a proper public park. And the park rangers are really, they're amazing. So to make a safe space as an artist, it's always tricky, because what for one person is safe is not for another, right? Or might not be for me or for the other person. So I have an ambiguous relationship to what's called safe space. What I can do, or what I look for in providing, is a space where attention is given to the needs of those who are participating with each other, which means sometimes people just need to talk, or they need a hot meal, or sometimes we need to push something creatively, right? And I think for me, the unsafe space is that which I want to challenge the viewer. So so in a way, the people who participate with me, even including this new film, but in particular, like now Here for Life, we wanted to challenge the viewers. We wanted to, like what you say, we wanted to play with them in these loops. Oh, they will believe this, but actually, what if we do this? So we constantly were probing and pushing with the language of cinema, where we would get you, and then we would also challenging questions. So where are you? Where would you be? What would you do? So this is really important, because the viewer, of course, is like, without the viewer, the film is not complete. So the viewer is always invited to be part of the work, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, that's another space. So I always think about those spaces. So it's involved. I make involved spaces rather than extractive spaces, hopefully.
Yeah, and I did feel yes, I felt as if it was okay. So another problem, I guess, of the idea of a safe space, you know, and I brought that phrase in, so I should be the one who kind of scratches my head over it too. I think that it can be boring, you know, if you, artistically speaking as well, if something is static, you know, if it's completely settled and there's no kind of disruption, then it's not moving. There's no movement. And I think what you do in Here for Life, which is so intriguing, is I felt like I was being sucked in and then pushed away and moved around, and my space was consciously being interrupted, and so I was inhabiting this this sort of this unease, and it's, the film stayed with me a lot after I'd watched it, and I watched it again, and then of course, as I said, I like fish, so I played it for the soundtrack, and so because I was enjoying that. So it feels like a very thought through, very dense thing with a lot of layers in it. And so I wanted to ask you, because we've got about 10 minutes left, and there's a couple of questions more to come from other people. But I wanted to ask you, if you were to talk to somebody who was to step into that magical booth in Bury Art Museum and look at your film and be with your film for a while, what would you like to say to them about that? What would be the invitation?
Come with us for a ride. This is an adventure, right? And it's wayward in a really beautiful way. It's kind of quite wild, but it's tender and wild, and people want you to be part of it. You're invited into that world. I think we work really hard also making it, but also in the editing, to invite the viewer to be part of this world, not to be a stranger, but to participate, because we can. So this is the other thing for me about work, is like, what this gaze that looks with pity upon people and therefore can say, oh, let's have all these policies to enable their lives to be better, but not ever doing it, right? So there's just a lot of money being pushed around instead of going to the people who actually need it. So what that does, it makes us estranged from each other. So, you know, I myself come from like an underclass background, like, and I have a particular relationship sometimes against people with privilege. I had to work a lot on not reacting, right? Okay. And in my life, and I'm older now, so but this is a constant process where I feel like inequality and injustice is so everywhere. I see it very strongly because I've experienced it in a way when I was younger. But what we want to do with this film is reject that division. We wanted to say, you know, we can find each other. We have to find each other. The only way forward is if we find each other. There's no, we have to see each other in all the differences that we have, and find the humanity deep within us. And this is why this kind of archetypal storytelling is important. What Adrian and I wanted to get to with the actors, with the stories, and story swapping. It's like, sometimes, you know, we need to hear our story told by somebody else. So we feel like, I can now actually talk about this. I couldn't before, but now I can. Or somebody reflects back the story, so you can add to it and say, that's actually, I want to also add this. So it's very powerful when we have each other to help each other to understand the lives that we are living in these times that sometimes we can't really understand power, right? Like it happens to you. So we need each other, and we need to each other also to see, because what I see is not what you see, but I can't see what you see, right? So what are the strategies by which we find each other? So we wanted to invite the viewer to be part of that space. It's a generous space, I feel like, what the actors made there.
I mean, there's an amazing example of that's really, really stuck in my head. And there's this bit where Errol is arrested, and okay, so, and I'm not sure. This is the thing about this film, folks, because Errol is arrested, and he's at the same time, and he as he's being arrested, he looks really calm. And I started thinking, so that he knew that was going to happen all along, and so suddenly Errol, instead of being the person who's the victim, is in some way, you start thinking, well, he's kind of he's precipitating this event. Mm-hmm. And then he looks at the camera and he just says, with this and it's kind of quite mischievous in a way, the look on it's a really amazing look on his face, because he's very angry as well. But he's also, I mean, I might be missing stuff, but he also looks almost amused, and he sort of says, let's be free. And he says it right to you. And come on, everybody, let's be free. And it's quite an amazing moment, because you're being invited into something which is at the same time, it's scary and it is a wild ride, as you said. Maybe we could finish with you saying a little bit about that moment.
Thank you for raising that too. It's an important scene, because that's the only scene which is not from us. So Errol is a black man and quite tall. He knew if he's trying to cut the lock of his own bike, of which he had lost the key, he would probably be arrested. He knew that was going to happen, because he had been arrested many times, stopped and searched hundreds of times, right? So he asked a friend to come and said, if anything happens, can you just film it? And of course, then the police come, and then they film it, and many other people filmed it. And then he just sent us the footage and said, look what just happened. I knew that was going to happen. Yeah, and then we asked, that was very, very early on in the filming, before we even knew. And then at some point later on, it's like, oh, maybe actually we should use that. It would fit really perfectly within the stories that we were telling, about how this happens. And the reason why he's so relaxed and angry at the same time is because it's just a pattern that, you know, happens to some bodies a lot more than other bodies, and it shouldn't happen to anybody really. So nobody even asked him, what are you doing? They didn't even ask him. They just said, okay, I think you're coming with us. And then of course he says, no, I'm not. And then this escalation starts, you know. But oh yeah, so this is important. And why I really like this is because, like in all my work, if you see all my work, which has difficult moments in it, where things happen that are very difficult, where structures come down on one, they're always with they're full of strength and a refusal to be the victim through the gaze of power. And that one is a really good example.
Full of strength and refusing to be a victim through the gaze of power. I think that's a very, very good place to end. Thank you very, very much, Andrea. It's been
Thank you.